The goats poured from the high pasture like a river of cream and stone, their clattering hooves a sudden drumbeat in the baked silence. At the head of the flock ran a great white doe, her beard jaunter than a cattle baron's tie, her yellow eyes fixed on the one patch of green in a world of brittle brown. Behind her, 50, 60, a whole cascade of life flowed down the gully Clara had dug, a channel that led from the secret mouth of her spring to the troughs she and the boy had built. It was the only water for 10 miles, and as the town watched from the dusty road, their faces tight with a mixture of awe and shame, the man who had tried to ruin her stood beside his uselessly fenced-off mudhole, his mouth a thin, bitter line. He had counted on her being one person alone. He had counted wrong. 18 months earlier, Clara had been one person alone, and it was a state that felt both permanent and perilous. Her husband, Thomas, had been taken by a lung fever that spring, leaving her with his name, a stack of debts, and 40 acres of land the county surveyor had likely mapped from memory, for no one in their right mind would have walked it. It was scorned land, all rock and ravine and stubborn juniper, with a thin topsoil that blew away in the wind. The good folk of Promise Creek had offered their condolences in the form of pitying looks and blunt advice. "Sell it, Clara," Jedediah Marsh had told her, his own vast cattle ranch pressing in on her eastern border. "A woman alone can't work a place like this. It'll break you." She'd met his counsel with a stillness that was often mistaken for compliance. She nodded, thanked him, and watched him ride away, his back straight with the certainty of a man who had never been wrong about the price of beef or the weakness of others. She spent the first month in a haze of grief and labor, mending the cabin's roof, clearing the choked well, and walking the boundaries of her inheritance. It was on one of these walks, in the raw heat of late May, that she found it. A cry, thin as a thread of spun silk, from a dry ditch at the edge of the road. There, tangled in thistle, lay a newborn goat, no bigger than a loaf of bread. Its coat was slick with the fluids of birth, its mother nowhere to be seen, likely astray from some traveler's wagon, dropped and abandoned. One of its back legs was bent at a cruel angle. Clara knelt. The thing was all bone and ear and desperation. The common sense of the valley, the voice of men like Jedediah, told her what to do. A swift, merciful end. It was vermin, a pest that would eat what little grass there was and give nothing back. But as she reached for it, a tiny pink mouth opened and closed, searching for something that was not there. Clara paused. She saw not a pest, but a fellow orphan on a hard piece of ground. With a sigh that seemed to pull up the last of her sorrow and turn it into resolve, she scooped up the kid. It was weightless, fragile. She cradled it against her chest, tore a strip from her petticoat to splint the broken leg, and carried it home. The men at the general store saw her coming. "What you got there, Clara?" one called out, a smirk playing on his lips. "Found yourself a new beau?" She walked past them, her chin held high. "Just a bit of scrap," she said, her voice even. "Something the ditch threw away." She didn't see Silas Blackwood watching from the shade of the store's porch, a man whose business was land and whose profit was other people's desperation. He saw the scorned woman with the worthless animal on the useless land, and the arithmetic in his head began to hum. To him, it was a simple equation of failure adding up to opportunity. He gave her 6 months. That evening, Clara sat by her hearth, feeding the kid warmed cow's milk from a rag. The tiny creature sucked greedily, its life force a flickering candle she was determined to shield from the wind. She named her Ditch. It seemed right. A name to remind her where they had both started. The next day, a shadow fell across her doorway. An old woman stood there, her face a map of wrinkles, a black kerchief tied tight over her white hair. It was Anya Petrova, whose small plot of land was tucked away in the farthest corner of the valley, a place most people avoided. They said she was a foreigner, from some old, forgotten country where they talked to crows and planted by the moon. "The leg," Mrs. Petrova said, her voice thick with an accent that rounded her words. She pointed a gnarled finger at the splint. "Is not set right. Will heal crooked." She came inside without being asked, her movements slow but certain. She unwrapped Alara's clumsy bandage, her touch surprisingly gentle, with a sharp, precise movement that made the kid bleat in pain and Alara flinch. She reset the bone. "There, now is straight." She showed Alara how to bind it with stiff leaves of comfrey from her own garden. "Goat is not cow," she said, looking around the sparse cabin. "Goat is smart. Smart and stubborn, like good woman." A rare smile cracked her face. "You feed this one, she will feed you, but not on grass, on the hard things, on the brush, on what everyone else throws away." As she left, she paused and looked back at Alara. "In my country, they say, some things, they must grow in the hard places. It makes them strong." The words settled in Alara's mind, a seed falling into prepared soil. It was the first kindness she had received that was not laced with pity. The town's mockery, however, was a constant low hum. "Heard you've taken up ranching, Alara," a man would call out. "Goat ranching!" The laughter would follow, coarse and easy. She learned to wear it like a cloak, to let it slide off her. Her focus narrowed to the small, warm life in the box by her fire. She began the arithmetic of survival. One goat was a pet. A herd was a living. The distance between the two felt as wide as the prairie. Silas Blackwood paid his visit a week later. He rode a fine black horse and wore a suit that seemed out of place against the dust of her yard. He took off his hat, his smile a smooth, polished stone. "Mrs. Miller," he began, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "I was so sorry to hear of your loss, and I see you're trying to make a go of it. It's admirable, truly." His eyes flickered to the cabin, the patched roof, the single goat kid sleeping in a patch of sun. "But this is no place for a lady on her own. I'd be willing to take it off your hands, for a fair price, of course. Enough to get you a nice room in town, to start over." He named a figure that was an insult, enough to pay her husband's debts and leave her with precisely nothing. Alara looked at him, her face calm. She thought of the warmth of the kid against her skin, of Mrs. Petrova's words. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "But I believe I'll stay." His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "A foolish choice," he said, his voice losing its warmth. "Pride is a luxury the poor cannot afford." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving the dust to settle. Alara watched him go, then turned and went back to her work. She had a goat to raise. By June, Ditch's leg had healed clean and strong, and her personality had begun to emerge. She was, as Mrs. Petrova had predicted, possessed of a comic dignity. She would stand on the highest rock in the yard, surveying her tiny kingdom as if she were a queen, her little beard twitching. She followed Alara everywhere, a silent four-legged shadow, occasionally nudging her hand for a scratch behind the ears. The gentle irony was not lost on Alara. The creature everyone scorned behaved more like a loyal dog than a farm animal. The bond between them solidified into a quiet companionship that eased the ache of her loneliness. But affection didn't pay bills. The arithmetic was relentless. To start a herd, she needed a buck. To buy a buck, she needed money. She took on mending for the few families who would hire her, her fingers growing rough with needle and thread. She sold what few eggs her scrawny chickens laid. Every penny was saved in a loose-lidded jar on the mantelpiece, a secret hoard of hope. She learned the land through Ditch's eyes. While the cattlemen worried about their vast fields of grass turning brown under the sun, Ditch thrived. She ignored the grass. Instead, she ate the bitter leaves of the juniper, the thorny scrub, the tough weeds that grew in the rocky soil. She had a connoisseur's palate for the things no other animal would touch. Following her, Alara began to map the hidden economy of her 40 acres. She found patches of wild onions, hardy herbs, and, in a shaded, damp ravine, a sprawling colony of mushrooms. She harvested them carefully, taking them to Mrs. Petrova, who taught her which were for eating and which were for medicine. The old woman nodded, watching the girl work. "The land speaks," she would say. "You are learning its language." By August, the sun was a hammer and the land was an anvil. The creek that ran through the valley was shrinking, its song growing faint. The cattle stood listlessly in the heat, their ribs beginning to show. In town, the talk was of drought. Alara felt the fear, a cold knot in her stomach, but she refused to let it rule her. She had Ditch, who was fat and glossy. She had her jar of coins, which was nearly full. And she had a plan. She traveled 2 counties over, to a settlement where goats weren't viewed with such contempt. There, she found what she was looking for, a young Saanen buck, all white and defiant, with a proud Roman nose. The price took every cent she had, and the cost of hiring a wagon to bring him back put her into debt with the driver. When the buck arrived, it was a spectacle. The men in Promise Creek stopped their work to watch. "Well, I'll be," Jedediah Marsh muttered, shaking his head. "She's doubling down on foolishness." The laughter was louder this time, sharper. It was one thing to keep a stray as a pet. It was another to invest real money in a pair of them. Silas Blackwood heard the news and smiled. The girl was digging her own grave. It would make acquiring the land that much cheaper. Alara ignored them all. She named the buck Scandal and put him in the sturdy pen she had spent weeks building. Ditch, at first, was unimpressed. She treated him with the disdain of a queen for a court jester. But nature, patient and persistent, took its course. Alara waited, and she worked, and she watched the sky for rain that never came. Winter arrived with a thin, grudging snow that did little to replenish the earth. The cold was a physical presence in Alara's small cabin, but she had a supply of firewood and a growing sense of purpose that kept her warm. She also had a new companion, a boy named Finn. The quiet, overlooked son of a blacksmith had started appearing at the edge of her property. He never spoke, just watched from a distance as she went about her chores. He was thin and watchful, with eyes that seemed to take everything in. One day, Alara was struggling to haul a bucket of water from the well, her hands numb with cold. Without a word, Finn came forward, took the bucket from her, and carried it to the cabin. From that day on, he was a regular presence. He had a preternatural calm that the goats responded to. He would sit for hours in their pen, and they would gather around him, resting their heads on his knees. He seemed to understand their quiet, observant nature. He started helping with the work, mucking out the pen, hauling feed, checking the fences. Alara paid him what little she could, a few coins here and there, but she knew it wasn't the money that brought him. He was finding a purpose, a place where his stillness was a virtue, not a fault. In the dark heart of winter, Ditch grew heavy with new life. Alara watched over her with a fierce, maternal anxiety. The arithmetic had shifted. A successful birth would mean the start of everything. A failure would mean ruin. One frigid night in February, the time came. With Finn holding a lantern and Mrs. Petrova murmuring encouragement in her native tongue, Alara helped Ditch deliver 2 healthy kids, a dueling and a buckling. They were perfect, their coats thick, their cries robust. Alara held them, the warmth of their small bodies seeping into her, and felt a joy so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. It had worked. Her flock was now 4. She had done it. One person alone, or rather, not quite alone. She had a quiet boy, a wise old woman, and a flock of animals no one else wanted. As spring approached, the land remained stubbornly dry. The meager snow had melted, and the ground was already cracking. But in Alara's small corner of the world, there was a secret. Ditch came into milk. It was rich and creamy, with a clean, sweet taste. Mrs. Petrova taught Alara the ancient art of cheesemaking. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic. The warming of the milk, the adding of the rennet she'd learned to make from thistle, the cutting of the curd, the careful pressing and salting. It was a craft of patience and precision. Her first cheeses were small, lumpy things, but they tasted of the wild herbs and the stubborn earth. They tasted like survival. Finn, who had begun to talk in small, infrequent bursts, took it upon himself to name the new goats. The little dueling was Willow, for the way she bent without breaking. The buckling was Boulder, for his stocky build. He knew them all, their habits, their preferences. He was the flock's silent chronicler. Ilara's success was a secret she kept banked low, like a coal under ash. To the town, she was still the foolish goat woman, poorer than ever. She hid the true richness of her life, the growing flock, the buckets of milk, the wheels of cheese aging in her cool stone cellar, behind a facade of quiet struggle. Let them think she was failing. It was safer that way. Being right was its own kind of reply, and it did not need to be spoken aloud. By the second summer, Ilara's flock had grown. Willow had been bred to scandal, and another set of twins had arrived. The herd now numbered 6, and the milk was plentiful. The cellar held a growing treasure of firm, white wheels of cheese, wrapped in cheesecloth and aging to perfection. Each one was a testament to her patience, a small victory against the scorn of the world. Finn was now her indispensable partner. He had a herdsman's instinct, knowing when a goat was off its feed, or where the best browsing could be found in the parched landscape. He had named the entire flock, a litany of simple, descriptive names: Dusty, Patches, Elder, Sky. The goats were no longer just livestock. They were a community, each with a personality the boy knew intimately. The humor of it all was a private joke between them. A town that revered the brute force of cattle was being outwitted by a handful of creatures with an appetite for weeds and the dignity of disgruntled professors. Ilara's arithmetic was becoming more hopeful. The cheese was her future, but she needed a market. A place beyond the closed mines of Promise Creek. The opportunity arrived in a cloud of dust. A fancy carriage, bringing a chef from the new Grand Hotel that had been built in the county seat 30 miles away, broke a wheel just outside her property. The chef, a portly man from the city named Monsieur Armand, was furious and impatient. While his driver struggled with the wheel, he paced and cursed the primitive conditions of the frontier. Ilara offered him a drink of water. He took it grudgingly, eyeing her patched dress and the curious goats peering at him over the fence. "What is it you farm here, madam?" he asked, his tone condescending. "This wasteland?" "A little of this and that," Ilara said calmly. "Mostly I raise goats." Monsieur Armand laughed, a short, barking sound. "Goats? Bah! The food of peasants, stringy meat and foul milk." Ilara felt a familiar stillness settle over her. She did not argue. Instead, she went into her cabin and returned with a small plate. On it were a few slices of her best aged cheese, a drizzle of wild honey she'd found, and some hardened crackers. "Peasant food," she said, and held it out to him. He was about to refuse, but the smell, sharp, nutty, and clean, stopped him. He eyed the plate. With a theatrical sigh, He took a piece of cheese, placed it on a cracker, and popped it into his mouth. His face went through a remarkable transformation. The disdain vanished, replaced by surprise, then concentration, then pure, unadulterated delight. He closed his eyes. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. He ate another piece, slowly this time, savoring it. This is not goat cheese. This is chèvre, true chèvre. How? He looked from the cheese to Clara, his eyes wide with a chef's avarice. "Where did you get this?" "I make it," she said simply. He stared at her, then at the goats, then back at her, the gears of his culinary mind turning. He saw not a poor woman on a barren plot, but an artist, an untapped resource. The broken wheel was forgotten. He followed her into the cool, dark cellar, and his eyes grew wider still at the sight of the neatly stacked wheels. He tasted a younger, softer cheese and nearly wept. Before the wheel was fixed, Monsieur Armand had made a deal with her. He would buy every wheel of cheese she could produce. He would pay a price that made Alara's breath catch in her throat, and he would send a wagon every 2 weeks to collect it. The arrival of the hotel wagon every other Friday became a new source of speculation in Promise Creek. It was a fine wagon, pulled by a matched pair of bays, and it kicked up a confident cloud of dust. The driver was close-lipped, deflecting all questions with a shrug. The townsfolk knew it was for Clara, but they couldn't fathom what she could possibly be selling from her worthless land that would warrant such regular attention. "Maybe she's selling rocks for garden decoration," one man joked at the store. "Or maybe she's selling herself," another muttered, and was met with a few uncomfortable chuckles. Jedediah Marsh watched the wagon come and go, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He had built his life on the predictable value of land and cattle. Clara and her goats were an anomaly, a riddle he couldn't solve. It was easier to believe she was engaged in something disreputable than to admit he might have been wrong about her, and about the land. Clara ignored the whispers. She, Finn, and her growing herd were an island of quiet productivity. The money from Monsieur Armand was a steady, life-giving stream. First, she paid off the wagon driver who had brought scandal. Then, she settled all of Thomas's debts at the general store. The storekeeper looked at the pile of coins on his counter, his expression one of pure astonishment. Clara simply nodded and left. The arithmetic had finally tipped in her favor. She was no longer just surviving, she was building. She bought another son and doling from the next county, then another. By the time the third spring arrived, her flock numbered 12 milking does. The work was hard and constant, from sunrise to sunset, but it was satisfying work. The milking, the cheese-making, the mucking, the mending of fences, it was a rhythm that became the beat of her life. Finn, now a lanky teenager, was her shadow and her foreman. He knew the goats better than she did, and they trusted him completely. He had found his voice, not in talking to people, but in the quiet language of the herd. The town's mockery had faded, replaced by a grudging, suspicious silence. The visible evidence of her modest success, the debt payments, the new fencing, the healthy-looking animals, could not be denied, but it could not be explained either. It is a strange human habit to resent the success of those you have already judged as failures. Silas Blackwood was no longer smiling. His easy condescension had curdled into a watchful envy. He had seen the hotel wagon. He knew what a place like that paid for specialty goods. He had assumed Clara would fail and fall into his hands like a ripe plum. Instead, she was thriving on the very land he'd dismissed. His desire for her property sharpened from a casual ambition into a pointed obsession. He began to ride the borders of her land more frequently, his eyes scanning for a weakness, a loophole. He knew, from old survey maps, what no one else in the valley seemed to remember. Her 40 acres contained the deep, reliable aquifer that fed the entire Promise Creek water table. In a normal year, it didn't matter, but the years had not been normal. The drought was no longer a threat, it was a siege. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky was a pale, bleached-out blue, empty of clouds for weeks on end. The Promise Creek, once a lively artery of the valley, had dwindled to a series of stagnant, muddy pools. The prairie grasses were tinder dry, and the great cattle herds of men like Jedediah Marsh stood gaunt and miserable, their hides stretched tight over their bones. The price of hay had skyrocketed, and there was none to be had. The mood in the town had grown brittle as the landscape. Faces were tight with worry, and the usual easy banter at the general store had been replaced by grim, clipped conversations about water levels and dying stock. Hunger, once a distant abstraction, was becoming a real and present fear. On Ilara's land, however, things were different. Her goats, with their Catholic tastes, were still finding plenty to eat in the deep-rooted scrub and hardy weeds that other animals disdained. They were sleek and content, and while the town's wells were running low, forcing families to ration every drop, Ilara's well, sunk deep into the earth, still provided cool, clean water. Better yet, in the farthest, rockiest ravine of her property, a place no one ever went, was a small, hidden spring. It seeped directly from the aquifer Blackwood coveted, a secret trickle of life that she and Finn had discovered. They had dug it out, creating a small, stone-lined basin that stayed full even as the rest of the world turned to dust. This was their secret weapon, the heart of their survival. Silas Blackwood began to make his move. He started by spreading poison in the form of whispers. "It's unnatural," he'd say to the anxious men in town. "For her to have so much while the rest of us suffer. Those goats are a blight. They're sucking the ground dry, I tell you." He played on their fear and their old prejudices. He then approached Ilara again, his facade of friendliness gone, replaced by a cold, predatory certainty. "The town is suffering, Mrs. Miller," he said, his eyes like chips of flint. "And you are sitting on the solution. That spring of yours, by rights, the water belongs to the valley." "This spring is on my land, Mr. Blackwood," Ilara replied, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "The deed is clear." "Deeds can be challenged," he sneered. "Especially when a lone woman is hoarding a vital resource. And with a herd of 60 goats, you must be using more than your share." Ilara froze. 60. It was the exact number of her flock, counting the new kids. It was not a guess. He had been watching, spying, counting her animals, calculating her success, waiting for the moment to strike. The antagonist had finally shown his hand. "You have two choices," Blackwood continued, pressing his advantage. "Sell me the land for the price I offer, a generous one under the circumstances, or I will file a formal complaint with the Territorial Water Board. I have friends there. They will see things my way. They will say a herd of that size constitutes a commercial enterprise that is draining a public resource in a time of crisis. They will seize your water rights, and your land will be worthless. Either way, this place will be mine." He smiled, a victor's smile. He thought he had her trapped. One person alone, against the law, against the town, against the drought itself. It was not one person alone. It was a woman, a boy, and a herd of 63 goats, if you counted the 3 newest kids Finn had named Sparks, Cinder, and Ash. Ilara stood her ground. "My goats drink less water in a week than one of Mr. Marsh's cows does in a day," she stated, her voice quiet but resonant with the authority of fact. "And my spring is my own. I will not be selling." Blackwood's face flushed with anger. "You will regret this," he hissed, and spurred his horse away, leaving a cloud of accusation hanging in the air. The threat settled over Alara's land like the endless, empty sky. She and Finn worked in a tense silence, the joy of their labor replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. The arithmetic was no longer about growth, but about loss. What could she do against a man like Blackwood, with his money and his connections? He was true to his word. He began to turn the town against her, framing her self-sufficiency as selfish hoarding. He bought the last of the water rights to the dwindling creek, fencing off the final public pool where the townspeople had been able to water their kitchen gardens and their few remaining animals. He was creating a crisis he could then use as a weapon against her. The turning point came on a blistering afternoon in the third week of the drought. Jedediah Marsh appeared at her gate, not on his proud stallion, but on foot, his hat in his hands. He was a man broken. His face was gray with exhaustion and defeat. He did not look at her, but at the dust at his feet. "Ilara," he began, his voice raspy, "I'm not here about my cattle. They're gone. Lost most of them. Sold the rest for pennies." He finally lifted his head, and she saw the deep shame in his eyes. "My wife, my kids, our well's gone dry. Completely. Blackwood's got the creek fenced off. We have no water, not a drop to drink." This was the moment, the culmination of all the mockery, all the scorn. Here was the man who had told her to sell, who had led the chorus of laughter, now standing at her gate begging. She could have turned him away. She could have named a price so high it would have stripped him of his last shred of dignity. The temptation was a bitter, satisfying taste in her mouth. She could have her revenge. She looked past him, at the dusty road where other figures were now gathering, watching. The whole town was there, their faces a mixture of desperation and hope. They had followed Jedediah, and in that moment, Ilara saw not her mockers, but her neighbors. She saw frightened people, thirsty people. She thought of Mrs. Petrova's words about things that grow in hard places. She looked at Finn, who stood beside her, his young face solemn. She had a choice, not between revenge and forgiveness, but between being the person they thought she was and the person she had become. "The water is for everyone, Jedediah," she said, her voice clear and carrying on the still air. "As long as it lasts." She swung open her gate. A collective sigh went through the small crowd. It was a sound of disbelief and profound relief. Jedediah Marsh stared at her, his mouth agape. He had come expecting a negotiation, a bitter reckoning. He had not expected grace. Ilara turned to Finn. "Open the channel," she said. With a nod, Finn ran up the gully toward the hidden spring. He pulled away the stones they used to block the small channel they'd dug, and a ribbon of clear, life-giving water began to snake its way down toward the troughs in the yard. But before it reached them, Ilara pointed toward the high pasture. "Finn," she called. "Let them run." The boy understood immediately. He scrambled up the rocky path to the high pasture where the goats were browsing peacefully in the shade of the junipers. He let out a sharp whistle, the signal he used to call them. And then it happened. The scene that would become a legend in Promise Creek. The goats came. Led by Ditch, now a stately matriarch, the entire flock poured down the hillside. They were not the gaunt, miserable creatures of the surrounding ranches. They were sleek, healthy, vibrant with life. A moving river of abundance in a desert of want. They flowed down the man-made channel, their hooves clattering, and fell upon the troughs, drinking deeply. The sight stunned the townspeople into silence. It was a visible, undeniable manifestation of everything they had mocked. Here was the worthless land, giving forth water. Here were the pestilent animals, thriving. Here was the foolish woman, the source of salvation. Silas Blackwood, drawn by the commotion, arrived just in time to see it. He saw the open gate, the townspeople filling their buckets from Alara's well, the water flowing freely. He saw Jedediah Marsh, his sworn enemy in all land matters, shaking Alara's hand, his face wet with tears. He saw his plan, his leverage, his entire strategy evaporate in the clear light of a generosity he could not comprehend. "This is my water," he bellowed, his voice shrill. "You have no right." Jedediah turned on him, his grief and shame finally finding a target. "Your water?" he roared. "The water you fenced off while our children went thirsty? This is Ilara's water, and she's giving it away." The town turned as one, their collective gaze falling on Blackwood. He saw not fear or deference, but contempt. He had miscalculated the arithmetic of community. He had counted on their greed and fear, but he had not factored in their decency or Ilara's strength. Shamed, exposed, and utterly defeated, he turned his horse and rode away, not just from Ilara's gate, but out of the life of Promise Creek for good. The drought broke a week later, with a gentle, soaking rain that lasted for 2 days. The land drank it in, and a faint blush of green began to return to the valley. But the town had been changed more profoundly than the landscape. The hierarchy, built on the value of cattle and the size of a man's ranch, had been broken. A new economy, one of resilience and mutual respect, was beginning to form. Ilara became the quiet center of this new world. She did not gloat. She did not say, "I told you so." Her vindication was in the changed faces of her neighbors. The mockery was gone, replaced with a deep, abiding respect. They no longer saw a foolish woman with a pet goat. They saw a provider, a leader. She established a fair system for the cheese and milk that were now in high demand within the valley itself. She traded cheese for hay from Jedediah's recovering fields, milk for blacksmith work from Finn's father, water rights for help expanding her barns. She refused to gouge, to profit from their earlier desperation. Her price was always fair. Generosity, she had discovered, was a more durable currency than spite. Finn had found his place. He was no longer the silent, overlooked boy, but the valley's foremost expert on goats, a young man with a quiet authority that everyone respected. He was saving his earnings to buy a small plot of land next to Ilara's, to expand the herd. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden light over the healing land, Ilara stood with Mrs. Petrova by the fence, watching the goats move toward the barn. The herd was thriving, a testament to an idea that had once seemed like madness. Ditch, her first friend, her foundation, nudged her hand, her yellow eyes calm and knowing. "You see," Mrs. Petrova said, her voice soft in the twilight. "I told you. Some things, they must grow in the hard places." Ilara looked out at her land, at the herd, at the lights coming on in the windows of the town. She thought of the tiny, broken creature she had found in a ditch, and the impossible journey that had begun in that simple act of kindness. Mrs. Petrova was right. The hardship had not broken them, it had made them strong.